Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Trombley and I'm a senior at the University of Pittsburgh, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research I do on traumatic brain injury. So my specific project is looking at something called non-neurologic organ dysfunction, which is abbreviated as NNOD, and it's basically a fancy name for organ dysfunction that occurs specifically after TBI. And it's known that NNOD can lead to unfavorable outcome in people who have survived traumatic brain injury, but it's not exactly known how this pathway from NNOD to unfavorable outcome occurs. One thing that we started exploring was maybe this pathway is mediated by chronic inflammation. So there's a lot known about acute inflammation after TBI and a little bit known about chronic inflammation. One of the things that happens after TBI is you have an initial pro-inflammatory response, and that manifests as something called systemic immune response syndrome, which is abbreviated as SIRS. And in response to that, you have an anti-inflammatory response, which is known as the compensatory anti-inflammatory response syndrome, which is abbreviated as CARS. And basically, SIRS and CARS kind of battle each other, trying to bring the body back into homeostasis. You want the anti-inflammatory response to balance out that pro-inflammatory response, but really what happens is they kind of make it even worse. So you end up with this thing called persistent inflammation, immunosuppression, and catabolism syndrome, which is known as PICS. And that's really bad for patient outcome because it leaves you immunocompromised. It might lead to organ dysfunction. So it's definitely not a favorable thing to have. So we kind of wanted to see if these inflammatory patterns are manifesting chronically after NNOD and if that's leading to unfavorable outcome. So this is how we came to our hypothesis. We hypothesized that altered chronic inflammatory profiles mediate the pathway from acute non-neurologic organ dysfunction to unfavorable outcome. So going into our methods a little bit, we had a lot of different markers we had to look at. We had to look at NNOD markers, which we broke those down into 5 different organ systems: renal, hematologic, non-immune and immune, cardiopulmonary, and hepatic. And you can see all of the different markers that were broken down, that we broke those systems down into there. And these markers and their levels for each patient were abstracted from the electronic medical record. They were all UPMC patients. And you can see the different thresholds for dysfunction there. And we also have the inflammatory markers that we looked for in the chronic inflammation patterns listed out there. And here is a breakdown of our cohort. So we had a pretty good range of people, but we excluded people with pre-existing conditions, who were 29 of our population. And we also excluded the people who did not survive 6 months out, which means that they had a GOS score of 1. And that was 9 individuals. So this picture here is kind of the pathway that we were looking at. We start with NNOD over here. And so that's in the acute phase. So it's only days 0 to 20. And then we looked at their chronic inflammation, which is from months 1 to 6 after injury. And we wanted to see if that led to unfavorable GOS at 6 months. So this A arrow here is showing just the direct relationship from NNOD to GOS. And we wanted to see if this B path really was there, if it really could explain part of the A path. So first we had to see if we even had organ dysfunction in our cohort. So we looked at each biomarker here, and we wanted to see how prevalent organ dysfunction was. Some markers showed great range of organ dysfunction, so things like neutrophils, white blood cells, and hematocrit all had really high percentages of organ dysfunction, but then others like creatinine or bilirubin showed really low levels of organ dysfunction. And first we had to see if there was even a pathway between our cohort for people who had NNOD and if it led to unfavorable GOS. So we needed to see if that A leg was even really there. So that's what we did in this table. We compared the people who had organ dysfunction in our 5 systems and their biomarker levels to unfavorable GOS scores at 6 months. So you can see that some are more predictive of unfavorable outcome than others. All of the ones that are in italics had p-values less than 0.1, so we call those trending markers, and then all of the ones that are starred have a p-value of less than 0.05, so those are our really significant ones. So something like lymphocytes with a p-value of 0.0052, that one was a really good predictor of outcome. And so this is kind of how we narrowed down which ones we wanted to look into to see if they were mediated through chronic inflammation, because we don't want to look into something that doesn't even predict from NNOD to GOS, because then it can't be mediated. So that was our first step, and then we moved into seeing if this leg here and this leg here were prominent. So we did that by seeing which NNOD markers predicted either raised or lowered levels of different inflammatory markers. And then we looked at which raised or lowered inflammatory markers would predict unfavorable outcome. So those results are kind of summarized in this chart down here, part B. So what you're seeing here is that you have TBI, which leads to organ dysfunction. The major ones we looked at were, again, cardiopulmonary, renal, hepatic, and 2 different types of hematologic, immune and non-immune. And then you see that only certain markers are good predictors of poor outcomes. So those are the only ones that we looked at. And then if you look between the NNOD markers and poor outcome, you can see that we listed out all of the inflammatory markers that were mediating the NNOD to GOS, unfavorable GOS pathway. So all of these markers all the way down here at the bottom are the things that make up this chronic inflammation right here. And we only listed out the significant ones because we had 33 different inflammatory markers. So here you're seeing the ones that are both, you're seeing the inflammatory markers that are both in this leg and in this leg. And then we wanted to see if there actually was mediation. So basically what we've done up to this point is see if there actually is a pathway here, here, and here. But now we need to see if that's actually a mediating pathway. So that's what we did here. We looked at BUN specifically because that showed really strong correlations of being mediated. So we first looked at the total effect from BUN dysfunction to unfavorable GOS score. And so that's what you're seeing here with the total effect. So the odds ratio is 2.14, which means that for every unit that you increase BUN dysfunction, it's 2 times more likely that you're going to have unfavorable GOS score. So that's what you're seeing here, and that was significant. We had a p-value of less than 0.05. But then what you're seeing here, the direct effect, that's when you take into account this mediating pathway. So when you take all of the chronic inflammation, the part of the pathway that is explained by chronic inflammation out of the total effect, you see that we're no longer significant. So that's really good. That's showing that this pathway from BUN dysfunction to unfavorable GOS is majorly explained by this chronic inflammation. This inflammatory load score here is just all of the markers that we found overlapped between this leg and this leg here. So what we were seeing here with our exemplar model of unfavorable outcome mediated by chronic inflammatory burden induced by BUN dysfunction is, it's just an example of one of the few different NNOD markers that we could look into to see if they're being mediated through an inflammation chronically. And in this model, we did adjust for all covariates such as age, gender, and GCS score. So that's also really important that all of our significant findings still held once those were adjusted. So that also explains that, or it also represents that this pathway is majorly found in TBI patients who have BUN dysfunction, regardless of age or gender or how severe their injury was. So going into our conclusions, we found that there is evidence that acute non-neurological dysfunction manifest chronically through altered inflammatory profiles to ultimately impact global outcomes. So basically what that's saying is that we found that this pathway is majorly explaining what's going on between marker dysfunction and unfavorable outcome. And that's really important for clinical work because in the acute phase, sure, you can help them survive, but if you don't know what's going to happen 1 to 6 months down the line, what is their long-term outcome looking like? So acute care is getting really better, really improved for TBI patients. And that's awesome that they're surviving that acute phase, but we also need to predict what needs to happen in the chronic phase and what kind of treatments we can be on the lookout for in order to prevent these unfavorable outcomes that we're seeing from chronic inflammation that is induced by these acute dysfunctions. So another interesting thing, if you remember back to when I was talking about Sears and CARS and how that battle can kind of result in PICs, is the markers that are creating these inflammatory load scores, those markers that are mediating this pathway, are actually a mix of both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory markers. So that's really interesting because if you remember, Sears is the pro-inflammatory response and CARS is the anti-inflammatory. And so we might see that these pathways that we actually already know a lot about in the acute phase may continue on into the chronic phase. So that could be really important for understanding future treatment and how we can approach these mechanisms if they're really similar to things we already know about. So for some future directions, some of our marker thresholds were not great in determining whether organ dysfunction was prevalent in the population. So if you remember when I talked about bilirubin or creatinine, those had really low levels of organ dysfunction represented in the population. So maybe in future studies, we need to adjust that threshold to be able to better represent what we're seeing in the population, what the actual organ dysfunction is looking like. And we also only use GOS as our outcome measure here, but GOS is not a holistic measure for outcome. So we suggest that in the future, we want to include measures like DRS or cognitive function to better capture the holistic picture of what this person's life is looking like 6 months. Because if something is significant to this leg, the NNOD to chronic inflammation leg, but then it's not significant to GOS, that might mean that it's branching off and predicting unfavorable outcome in other areas of their life that GOS doesn't capture. So that's pretty much my research to date and what we've been finding. It's really promising results and really might help predict different changes for acute and chronic care for TBI patients and kind of what we need to be on the lookout for. If anyone has any questions, my email is sht101@pitt.edu. Feel free to email me anything because I know that we can't exactly discuss in person right now. So I want to definitely get your questions answered, and thank you so much for watching.